My name is Mark from the Path of the Zen. So I'm going to talk about why I am not a Christian. And this question comes up quite a bit when I speak about Buddhism, and especially coming from a white boy who looks really European. And this is something that a lot of Asians and white Christians sort of look at me and they say, well, how come you're not a Christian? What happened there? So I'm going to talk about my Christian upbringing, my life in Christianity, and what led me to the departure of Christianity. So I was born in California about 1964, and when I was about 6 years old, my parents moved to a little place called Portland, Oregon. So Portland, back in the 70s, was pretty Christian. I mean, it was industrial, a lot of farmland. We had a lot of high tech moving up there, but it was very Christian. And I remember going to the various Christian churches with my parents. I think for a while they were Lutheran, and then they went to Methodist, and then they went to Presbyterian. And more or less, I would be shoved down into the church basement while the parents were upstairs in the main sanctum to go to Sunday school. And from, when you're about this high to a knee, growing up, you were told that Jesus is God. And pretty much you just believe it, because when you're, 8, 9, 10 years old, you know nothing. And if somebody says Jesus is God, you're just like, okay. And if they ask you, do you love Jesus? You're like, okay. What do you know? That's just flat out indoctrination of a young person at such an age where they have no ability to rationally think or to rationally decide for themselves. So as I went into my teenage years and into high school, there was a lot of these youth ministry programs that the high schools were allowing into the schools. And I remember one of them was a group called Sun City. And it was put on by a Presbyterian church. And so after high school at about 3:30, 4 o'clock, they would have a bus that would come to the high school, and all of us kids, there was a lot of kids, it was actually quite a few buses. We would get on the bus and we would go to the Presbyterian church. And at the church, they would feed us pizza and Kool-Aid, maybe some soda pop. And then we would go, they had a gymnasium setup where they would come out and put on quite a presentation to probably about 200 teenagers from all over the area, maybe 300 teenagers. Well, as you can guess, as a teenager, especially one that's starting of getting interested in girls and things like that, you kind of go where the cute girls are going. So you go to church because that's where they were going. And of course, you want the nice girls. You don't want the troubled ones. You don't want the ones that are already pregnant with somebody else's baby. You want a nice girl. You want a girl that you can actually, say, hey, maybe I'll meet somebody, have a nice life with, and somebody who's not going to cause me an immense amount of grief. So that's what, that was a lot of the motivation, I think, for a lot of us. And I think the girls were looking at it the same way, which is they were basically looking for potential husband material. So you got to remember, back in the mid-70s, when I was in high school, the path that most girls were on was that of the homemaker. Things like home ec and cooking and sewing were taught in high school. And for us guys, we were pretty much looking to go into farming or the local industries. So they really were not pushing this idea that we all were going to go to colleges and become doctors and lawyers. That was not at all the intent of the schools back then. And also we had the Vietnam War going on, and my high school instructors were basically also preparing a lot of us boys to be drafted. So that was also going on. So as I started to look into this thing called Christianity, and started to, say, is there anything to it? It really just came down to the simple message. Believe in Jesus, that He is your Lord and Savior, He is God, and that you shall go to heaven. That was it. There was not much more than that, other than, oh yeah, and live a virtuous life, because if you sin and things like that, you'll go to hell. So we were pretty much told that was pretty much what it is, and it was just that simple. Well, as I got older and I left the Portland area and I went into the Navy and, started meeting all kinds of different people and different opinions and different ideas, I really started to question this whole thing about Jesus, because one just sort of, you grew up with that stuff and you just sort of, it's just there and you don't really think about it all that much. So as I got into my about mid-20s, I really started questioning this whole thing called religion and where is this going. I started reading the Bible and started to really get deep into it and started to realize that there's really only the three books, that would be Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that really seem to be the original books, and they really seem to be the core teachings of what they, at least what these authors portrayed Jesus to think. And there's really no direct teachings of Jesus, and there's really no direct writings of Jesus or direct sermons. All we have is the accounts of what he said, and even those accounts really appear to be kind of a religious fantasy, kind of a religious musing or a religious interpretation of that. And then when you get into other books like John, and then that really is different. That really takes this religious fantasy to a whole nother level, in where it's basically saying, no, Jesus didn't just have a teaching, He's divine. He is the divine teacher. He is the divinity. Then when you start looking at Paul, and Paul is pretty much the writer of most of the New Testament, and Paul never met Jesus. He just claims to have visions that he claims that Jesus were in these visions. That Paul really takes the entire Jesus narrative and makes it into the divinity that Jesus is God, and that Jesus is, that's where the Trinity comes from. He's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And when you really start to look at where the Bible came from, how it was written, and the very fact that, Mark, Matthew, and Luke were not written by the disciples, they were written well after they had come and gone, you start to realize and understand that the New Testament is mostly just religious fantasy. And in fact, the New Testament was tacked onto the Old Testament, which would be the Hebrew scriptures, that of the Jews. And when you start looking at the Old Testament, you realize that that is also religious fantasy, with a lot of wisdom about how to properly run a society. So when I start to really look at what we call the Bible, I started to realize it was not addressing my fundamental spiritual questions, such as, why am I here? And why is there suffering? And how can I escape the suffering? And what I mean by suffering, I don't mean by physical suffering, because everybody physically suffers. So you have a body, you suffer. Really what I mean by, it's the mental anguish inside of you as to, wants and desires not being met, things that you have, things that go away, and it's all of the stresses of life. And you're trying to find some sort of peace, you're trying to find some sort of salvation within your own soul. And in fact, you really, really would like to say, how can I find peace? And this led me to a lot of questions of a lot of things. And I started asking people, well, what do other people think about this? And so I looked into Sufism. I checked out various other paths. I talked to Jews. I've talked to Muslims. And I started to realize that anything coming from the Abrahamic paths was just religious fantasy. That there was really nothing there other than a lot of wisdom from sages about happiness and marriage and running a society, a lot of morality and why morality is good. Let's face it, that immoral and unwholesome ways creates chaos, and that chaos creates suffering, and that suffering creates anger and anger and hate generally leads to things like war and destruction and more unhappiness. So, yes, there's a lot of wisdom in the Bible, the New and the Old Testament, a lot of wisdom in the Quran, a lot of wisdom in the Jewish scriptures, though they were not the answers I was looking for, which was spiritual salvation, spiritual departure from this. I wanted to understand what is the nature of spirit, what is the nature of this existence. And the Abrahamic religions did not answer that, and Christianity fell far short. So this led me into the study of, into looking at Buddhism through the advice of a psychology professor who said, well, you can look at things in a psychological way, which is modernism, or you can look at things in the religious views. And he suggested to take a look at the Buddhist views, since they particularly take on the question of suffering. So I started looking into Buddhism and started to realize that this guy called the Buddha, he really seemed to be answering my questions of suffering. Why is there suffering? It's because of all the mental attachments that I have formed since indoctrination. And let's just get it straight. You are indoctrinated to these attachments. You become accustomed to them. You become used to them. It's like putting on a favorite shoe, and then one day that favorite shoe is missing. You're like, oh my goodness, where are my shoes? So when you become accustomed, when you become something becomes your favorite, when something becomes habitual, it creates suffering, because you have the longing for the habituation, and then when the habituation is not met, you have the suffering for that longing for the thing to be there. So that's how it is. And then the Buddha basically said, well, hey, we have this practice called relinquishment, which is cutting the strings of suffering. And when you relinquish these things, you relinquish these desires, you are abating suffering. Suffering goes away. And that is the path to nirvana, the path to enlightenment. Well, that caught my attention, and started to really say, this Buddha guy, I think he's onto something. So then, you take the next step. Well, let's go find out what other people know about this. So you start going through the spiritual dictionary or your spiritual guide in your local town. And usually you can go to the spiritual bookshops or places where they sell incense, and they'll have a catalog of a directory of spiritual centers. And I opened it up, and right off the bat, I found Zen Buddhism. Well, Zen sounds cool. That's David Carradine right out of Kung Fu, right? So, I'm thinking to myself, what the hell? Maybe I'll go meet Master Po and have adventures or something. So I go trundling down to the Zen centers, and they're all about, we sit in a Buddha-like posture, for periods at a time, and we call that meditation, and we basically look at our own suffering. And I'm thinking, okay, this is cool. And so I sit down and start doing that, and right off the bat, I have very profound realizations as to the nature of my own suffering. And I go and I start having little talks with the teacher, and the teacher's like, yeah, it's pretty much what people come to, but they usually take a few years to get there, not usually, within a week or two. So I don't think they quite knew what to make of all that. So as I started to really understand for myself the nature of suffering, and then continuing the reading of the Buddhist scriptures and the Buddhist philosophies, I started to really to understand that I actually believed everything that the Buddha was teaching. And this wasn't just a belief because somebody told me to believe it. This was a belief because it was true for myself. This was actually becoming a conviction. And that's something that even surprised me, that, wait a minute, I'm having a conviction? This is definitely new. How did this happen? Where did this conviction come from? I was actually very shocked by it, that I actually thought that way and really felt that way. I felt it so strong that this conviction led me to move into a Zen center and become a resident student there, resident staff member, and then even move into a monastic center in California to even further my studies. That's what convictions can do to you. So that is basically a lot of what happened to me, and later on, when I have gone back and looked at Christianity, I still really see how Paul was really intent to create a church. And a church is not Christianity. The church is the church. Just like the Zen church is not Zen. The Church of Buddha is not Buddha, or is not the teachings of Buddha. It's its own thing. It's a means to organize, a means to propagate the teachings. Sometimes that's what it's for, or sometimes it's just to propagate itself. But it's also a means to glorify the teachings, or to glorify the message. And sometimes the glorification becomes the thing, and the message kind of gets lost in that. And I've seen that as well as in Buddhism, where the glorification is there, but the message is somewhere else. So I would encourage anybody listening to this to really look at your own convictions. What is truly a conviction of yours? In what is something that you look at yourself and ask, what do you truly believe? Do you truly believe that this Buddha guy, what he said is true? Yeah, I do understand there's probably a fair amount of religious fantasy and religious glorification within the scriptures. And I probably do understand that some of the scriptures are probably forgeries, well written after the days of the Buddha, or just somehow put into the Buddhist canon as a teaching, and really they probably have no business being in there. I could name a few of them, but I'd rather not at this time. And I also realize again that as translations are retranslated and things are retold, that things get changed. But yet, when you read enough sutras, you see the core message. The core message of Buddhism becomes quite clear, because it's there in most of the, I would call the authentic sutras. Then there are sutras that you read where they're very different, and their message is not the same. And you kind of can set those aside, and you'll figure that out for yourself when you read enough sutras. just like the Bible. Bible scholars have read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but when they get to John, that's different. And then when they get to the writings of Paul, which is most of the rest of the New Testament, that is also different. So you see the difference after a while. And then even within the original titles, you start to see that there's a lot of variations. And within this religious fantasy, within this religious glorification, you can kind of pick out some of the original messages and some of the original themes going on there, and make up for yourself what you mean for that. Because I have my own convictions about Buddhism that I don't necessarily say are the true convictions or this is the correct way. These are my convictions and the convictions that I have come to. You will have your own convictions, and those will be yours. And it's not for me to say that those are right or wrong or good or bad or higher or lower than anything else. As a Sangha member, I would hope that we can have a conversation and that we can talk about these things and that we can talk about our convictions. And a lot of times by sharing our convictions, we can kind of root out within our own mind, which is what is religious fantasy, and then what is a true belief, or what is working for us and what is not working for us. That is what, in my opinion, Sanghas do. They talk to each other. They help each other. This is not just about listening to a teacher. This is not just about coming in and doing ceremonies and leaving. If you are in a Sangha and you're not talking to each other, you're not checking each other out, you're not really getting deep into what is truth and what is fantasy, then you're not in a Sangha. You're in something else, maybe a cult or something. And I have heard that there are some Sanghas where only the teacher can speak, or you can't talk about your own practice, or you can't talk to anybody else about their practice. And again, that's not a Sangha, that's a cult. And if that is your Sangha, I guess I'm just advising you to change it or leave. So again, this path that we're on, and I also want to talk about, the path is not about robes or wearing beads or special clothing or about haircuts or burning incense or collecting Buddha statues and other religious ornaments. That's not the path. The path is not about a particular mannerisms, it's not about a culture, it's not about a cultural style, it's not about a people, it's not about a country or a land. That is not what Buddhism is about. Is it about ethics and is it about virtues? Yes. Is it about morality? In some ways, within the context of the culture. Is it about wisdom? Oh, yes. Is it about doing the work yourself? Yes. And this brings up an issue that sometimes Christians who come to Buddhism, they kind of take Buddha and they just put it on the cross. So you have Buddha on the cross, which that's not really Buddhism and it's not Christianity. It's just sort of a bucket of confusion, if you ask me. But sometimes that's what happens, is then people start worshiping Buddha as God or as the divine, very similar to how they were taught to think of Jesus as God and the divine. And that is a continuation of the brainwashing that they were indoctrinated with, and they have not really yet conquered that brainwashing. And yes, you can easily be brainwashed by in Christianity, and it's not to say that Christianity is a cult and it brainwashes people. It's just the way that some of these churches have chosen to operate and do things. And they engage in conditioning and brainwashing, and they believe that is ministry. They believe that they are ministering, and that is their sermons, is the brainwashing and the conditioning. I think a lot of Buddhists have come to realize that about Christianity. And I've heard the same thing about Islam, at least some of the Islam centers, and something about some of the Jewish centers, is that there is an extreme amount of brainwashing and conditioning that goes on there too. And like I said, the ministers that do this, that was what was done to them, and they're just doing it to others, and they believe that is the ministry of Christ, because they don't know. All right, well, I think I've said enough on this subject. Definitely hope that you gain something out of this. These conversations I'm having like this, they are informal. I don't really call them Dharma talks, I just call them talk. And they are not here to tell you, I'm not here to preach to you that Buddha said this, Buddha said that, or you should believe this or that. Nothing I'm saying should be taken as you should believe this. I'm not telling you what to think or what to do. I'm not telling you who can and cannot be a Buddhist. I'm not telling you what to believe. What I'm trying to do is just get you to think a little bit. Maybe something I said can get you to think about your own situation, your own beliefs, your own practice. That's all I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to be anybody's teachers. I'm not a teacher. I'm just a fellow Sangha member like the next person. I don't have a following. I don't have students. This is not something I have any interest in. I'm just going to continue to make videos like this, and I'm just going to continue to say things like this. And I'll do this until I no longer can. All right. Thank you very much, and please remember to like and subscribe.